It is important to know that African literature begins at the level of Europe. It means that African literature existed before the arrival of Europeans. When Europeans came, they came here for colonization, they brought school, they brought a religion, but understand that African literature is as old as the people themselves. It means that African literature existed since just when the culture started. In other words, it is as ancient and enduring as the people and societies that produce it. Here, what you need to know is that literature is part of the culture of the people. And remember that African societies were primarily traditional, and our cultures and literatures were oral. When we say that African literature did not begin, with the arrival of Europeans, it means that there was already an oral literature in Africa. So long before the written word reached African shores, through colonization and missionary education, African communities had developed elaborate systems of storytelling, song, poetry, and performance. So this means that long time ago, before the arrival of colonization, before the arrival of missionaries, there was, because it's true that the schools that we attend today, Western school, was brought by the missionaries during colonization. But before colonization, already African people, African communities had elaborate systems of storytelling, okay? Storytelling, just telling stories. They had their own system of songs, poetry, and performance. Performance relates to theater or demonstrating things that are very cultural, okay? So these oral forms captured the people's philosophies, histories, values, and emotions. What I have mentioned here, these systems of storytelling, songs, poetry, performance, they are oral forms. They are oral forms that help capture African philosophies, our way of life, our civilization, African histories, values, and emotions. Later, you will see that how was this done? There are people that we call griots or historians. The storytellers, they are griots. They tell the people their history. Some are not educated, but being a philosopher or being a storyteller does not mean being educated. You may not be able to write and to read in French or in English, but to tell stories, to be a philosopher. Be very careful with that. That is in the heart of all our communities, our cultures have these kind of practices. Griots or historians who tell the history of the community or the cultural group at a certain moment. So in fact, literature in Africa predates literacy, writing, and print culture. It means that literature or African literature existed before the arrival of Europeans. It means, in other words, African literature existed before writing and print culture. Writing means when Western school came in Africa with the missionaries and we started taking Western education. Print culture means writing books and printing. Now you can read Ambiguous Adventure. You can read Chinua Achebe. This is print culture. But before this, there was an oral tradition. There was an oral literature. Griots, storytellers, cultural performers, artists used the oral tradition to convey African literature. It was in many communities and is still a living art that binds together language, music, movement, and audience participation. So it means that this practice existed in the past and it still exists in the present. Go in the rural area, in the folk culture, okay? In folk villages, you will find this tradition still existing. Maybe our generation, we are insisted in Western education. We are in a school. We are at school learning, studying English, reading books. But the older generation, there are still people who keep this tradition going. That's why in Africa, we have different generations. We have the younger generation and we have the older generation. The older generation seems to be the generation of the traditionalist. Everything that is traditional in our archive, our heritage, is mostly conserved by this generation. There are griots, there are storytellers, there are historians who are here to keep the tradition going. That's why I say that it was in many communities and it is still a living art. We still have it. In traditional ceremonies, you find these people there. So when European explorers and colonialists arrived in Africa, they encountered a continent already rich in oral creativity and symbolic traditions. That's what I told you a while ago. So understand that. When Europeans came, they came here to occupy the land. When Europeans came, they came here to teach us their religion, to give us new education, new school. But they found here already a rich oral tradition. They found here Africa was already rich in oral creativity and symbolic tradition. Go to the south of Senegal in the Casamance, or go to the north in Senegal, north of Senegal in the Fouta Toro, or in Kédougou, or in Central Africa. You find traditions. Go to East Africa, go to West Africa, okay? The Zulu culture, or wherever you go, not only in Senegal, you go wherever you go, you find that archives or the heritage of Africa. Africa is culturally rich. It had its own tradition. It was rich in oral creativity and symbolic traditions. When we talk about this, meaning that there was a traditional school in Africa. The traditional school in Africa was oral tradition. Is it okay, class? Are you with me? Do you understand where I'm going with the introduction? This is to introduce you to African oral literature. Until now, the moment that I did tells you that there was something that literally the African oral tradition. However, colonial education and missionary influence introduced new forms of expression, especially writing in European languages such as English, French, Portuguese, etc. Yes, as I do, before the missionaries came, even colonization, there was still an oral tradition, symbolic traditions in Africa. We had our culture, we had our philosophies, we had our own poetry, traditional poetry, performance, storytellers, griots. They are artists. Remember, they are artists. The storyteller can tell you a narrative orally, certain récit. Those who are in the Pular culture, you have heard many storytellers. For example, in the Mali Masina tradition, you can hear Bokar Hamadun Farah telling the history of Umorowel Sambadonde, telling a lot of things. These are, narratives that relate to our culture. You go to the south of Senegal, people can tell you narrative about heroic figures who did great things, or in the Serer tradition, in the Jola tradition, in the Sose, the Mandinka, and the Manjak and other people. It existed. You go in East Africa or in West Africa or in Central Africa, in other cultures. For example, take Thomas Mofolo, Chaka. They tell a lot of things. It could be told orally because that's an epic. So it existed. And now, when the missionaries came in Africa, all right, they brought new forms of expression. What was a new form of expression? Because remember, in the past, our culture and literature was oral. It was not written. And when the missionaries came, they came with school. So a new form of expression started. That was, Western school. People started going to school, reading and writing. So from this encounter arose what we call modern African literature. Yes, modern African literature. We can call it the African literature that is written. That is written because there is now a new situation. Europeans have come with their languages. African people have gone to Western school. Some have learned French, some have learned English, some have learned Portuguese, and they can now read books. Now we start with literacy. We start with print culture. They learn creativity. And this modern African literature is a dynamic body of work that both preserves indigenous traditions and confronts the political, social realities and colonial and post-colonial Africa. I repeat, this means that modern African literature, the modern African literature is the one that came after the contact with Europe. It means after colonization. When Western school was established, people could go to learn Spanish, getting degrees, writing books, novels, poems. This is modernized. And this modern African literature, as I told you, is a dynamic body of work. This one helps the preservation of the indigenous traditions. It means that the oral tradition is not going to die. It is going to be revalorized. It is going to be incorporated. It is going to be kept. It is going to be valorized and rehabilitated. And this one, with a combination of the modern writing, is going to confront the political, social realities and colonial and post-colonial Africa. Now, the modern African literature tells a lot about the traditions, our past, our present, and our future. It is a combination of the three stages: past, present, future. Our past was oral, our present is written, and now it is digital, and our future, there are many perspectives. Okay? That's what modern African literature has done. The oral tradition is not going to die, class. No, it's going to be revalorized. It is going to be appreciated. It is going to be celebrated. Today, African literature encompasses, or African literature composes both oral and written form. I repeat, today, African literature, in the past, African literature was only oral. In the present, African literature is oral and written. It's because modern African literature is born after the contact with Europeans. Now Africans can learn, read, and write in European languages. They have written their oral literature. So the oral literature and the written literature are going to live side by side together. And to understand its development, one must explore how the oral foundation shaped the written traditions that came after. Yes, you need to understand that, okay? What are the foundations of African literature? You will see that African literature, modern African literature, is written. But what about traditional African literature? It was oral. And you can still find these forms. Now in chapter 1, we can talk about traditional African literature and the emergence of its modern literature. The objectives of this chapter is to help you as students understand the features and characteristics of oral literature and their role in African societies. It helps you identify the various forms of oral art, folk tales, myths, legends, praise poetry, proverbs. What is folk tales in French? C'est les contes. Myth, les mythes. Legends. Praise poetry is poetry that celebrates a person. Okay, c'est les éloges. In Wolof or others, people can call it tag or bak. You guess? You see what I care? You guess it now? Can you guess now what it is? Praise wrestling, what you call lamb. When a wrestler enters, it can be song, it can be poetry, a praise song or a praise poetry. In the back or in the tag, you hear the griot saying something and you see the wrestler is dancing. Okay? Or you see in a ceremony, it's a marriage or whatever. Maybe you belong to a noble family, or your father or your great-grandfather was a giant and a hero. You find a griot and your griot gives a praise poetry or a song about you. That's why you hear that those people who do that, bak or tag, they use traditional it. Okay, class? Is it clear? Are you familiar with what I told you? Is it okay, class? All right. Yes, it's okay. So you should understand how performance, music, and communal participation shape oral storytelling. Know the educational, moral, and social functions of oral literature. Recognize the griot or bard as historian. Educator, understand how oral art serves as both an entertainment and moral instruction. The griot, it is important here to emphasize the griot. The griot, you all know who is a griot in Senegal. But not every historian, because sometimes you can say someone, he is a griot. You say, no, I'm not a griot. Call him a bard. A bard is a poet, a traditional poet, or a historian or a storyteller who tells a lot of things, but he may not be technically a griot, because a griot in Africa has a connotation a griot in Senegal has a connotation. So some people want to be called griots, others do not want to be called griots. To use the technical word bard is better. He may be a bard, an oral tradition artist, a poet, or an artist who tells a lot of things. And understand oral art serves as both entertainment and moral instruction. Now, number one, section 1. I tell you about form and characteristics of oral African literature. Form and characteristics. What is a form of oral African literature? And what are the characteristics of oral African literature? Class, you should know this. It's important. Oral African literature is or represents the creative use of language, is spoken, sung, or chanted by communities to express ideas, emotions, beliefs, and history. I repeat, class, oral African literature is the creative use of language, spoken, sung, or chanted by communities to express ideas, emotions, beliefs, and history. So there is a creative use of the language in the oral tradition. It can be spoken, it can be sung, it can be chanted. All this is in the form of oral tradition. Because most pre-colonial African societies did not use writing systems for everybody, for everyday communication, their literature was primarily oral and transmitted through performance. Yes, understand that in pre-colonial Africa, it means before the arrival of missionaries, there was not any school. African people were not educated. They could not read or write in English or in European languages. They could only use their oral languages, their indigenous languages, and they could not write or read these languages. But the tradition existed. Their literature was primarily oral, and it was transmitted through performance. Yes, it means it was practical. For example, if they want to teach the people, they can do a performance. Okay? A performance could be poetry, it could be dance, it could be a song, it could be a theater. And in the piece theater, you can see a poet, you can see a dancer, you can see a singer who sings and performs, and you do that. There are many, many poets here in our societies. You do not know them. They do poetry very well. All right? So this literature was not static. It was dynamic and adaptable, changing with each performance according to the mood of the audience, the context of the gathering, and the personality of the performer. Yes, class, this is very important. What does this mean? Okay, this means that this form of performance or this form of literature was not static. It was dynamic. So it means that it was not only one way. It was not fixed. Yes, it was not fixed. No, it was dynamic. It was adaptable. It changes with each performance. Yes, it depends on the context. It depends on the mood of the audience. It depends on the context of the gathering and the personality of the performer. Let me give you a context. For example, if there is a funeral ceremony, a traditional funeral ceremony, In traditional religions, I'm telling you, I give you this example. In traditional societies, if a person dies, you hear the context. When the person dies, people are mourning, okay? It is a funeral ceremony, day, for example, a traditional one. I'm not talking about a Christian one or a Muslim one. A traditional mourning. The context is different. You hear people sing or you hear people do something traditionally. It is different when it is Lamb, the traditional wrestling in Senegal. It is a naming ceremony. It is different when it is a professional meeting, and it depends also on the performer. Yes. That's why we say the context is not the same. It can be happy, unhappy, sad. It can be dramatic. It can be extraordinary. In fact, oral literature appears in various forms. You have to understand that oral literature can be expressed or expresses itself in various forms. Folktales, myths, legends, epics, c'est les épopées, praise poems, proverbs, riddle, c'est les devinettes, tongue twisters, chant, and work songs. So each form served a specific function within the community. So all these are aspects of the oral literature. And each of them, each oral form, has served a specific function within the community. Let us start with folktales, for example. Folktales were used to teach moral lessons and to entertain during evening gatherings. Yeah, maybe your generation, I don't know if you were interested in this or that, at a certain moment around the fireplace or during cultural, you hear old men, or even among you, you can be asked to give a folktale, Buki, hyena, and hare, okay? Lion, tortoise, whatever. Okay? And you tell folktales. Myths, for example. Myths explains the origin of the world, humanity, and natural phenomena. If you take the case of myths in many societies, there are so many myths. All right? I was just a comment. So the myths help explain the origin of the world, humanity, and natural phenomena. There are many myths in many traditions. Myths are there. They help you know what is the origin of the world, human, natural phenomena. There are many things related to myths. Proverbs. Proverbs convey wisdom and summarize collective experience in memorable phrases. Proverbs in any culture, you find proverbs, and people use it a lot in the oral tradition. Praise poetry. Praise poetry celebrated heroes, ancestors, and rulers. That's what I told you, tag. Okay? Come to the king's house and you started celebrating them. Your great-great-grandfather was a leader, he was a president, or your ancestors or rulers. The same in the traditional activities like lamb, the traditional wrestling. They can use a praise song like the Bak. If you remember Mam Gorginjai, There is still someone who uses the praise song to sing what he has done. And all the wrestlers, if you do that, they stand up and they start performing. It's because of that. You go to a ceremony, a cultural ceremony, or whatever. You find a VIP person or a great man, and you start giving praise poetry or praise poem of his great grandfathers. You hear that in Wolof, some more definitely, some more demon fale. Okay, you belong to the family of Alburi Njai, or you belong to the family of how can I say Alin Sute Jata or whatever, or El Haj Umar and Ladjor. You start praising the person and you celebrate their heroes or ancestors or rulers. So now, unlike Western literature, which tends to categorize clearly works into distinct genres, such as drama, poetry, and prose, African oral literature seems holistic and integrative. What this means that it's a little bit different from Western literature, because Western literature seems to categorize literature in different genres, classifying them, saying this is drama, this is poetry, this is prose. You learned it in the first semester in my course, Introduction to Literature. The difference here is that in African oral literature, this literature seems to be holistic and integrative. It seems to be more general and to integrate everything inside. Because in one particular genre, you can find other things. For example, a single performance could combine narration, music, dance, and costume. So in one performance, you can see the performer doing praise poetry, and at the same time doing praise song, singing, at the same time dancing, at the same time using music or costume, or at the same time doing a narration. He started giving a folk tale, or he started telling a story. And remember that the narration couldn't be like the novel or prose. And poetry is more rhythmic. It uses rhythm, it uses rhyme, everything, and song, music. So you can find a combination of all these in one thing only. While in Western literature, when you say that Ambiguous Adventure is a novel, Cahiers de Retour au Pays Natal is poetry. Okay? La Tragédie du Roi Christophe is drama. L'Aventure ambiguë or Ambiguous Adventure, it's a novel, c'est un roman. OK? Cahiers d'un retour au pays natal, c'est de la poésie. All right? L'exil du roi Albouri, c'est une pièce de théâtre. But here in African oral tradition, you can find that it is holistic and integrative. One single performance can integrate all of them. It means one performer can combine, can make a combination of narration, music, poetry, song, drama, and everything. Do you get me, class? Are you following, class? Are you with me? Please, I want to see the comments of those who are on the YouTube. I hope everything is okay there. Yes. But I cannot see their comments. All right. So the storyteller, okay, The storyteller sometimes called a griot, a bard, or a minstrel, acted as historian, musician, teacher, and entertainer. I told you the storyteller can be a griot. You all know what is a griot in Africa, as I told you. A griot has a cultural connotation. As I told you, not everyone wants to be called a griot. Okay? So do not call everybody a griot. You can call them a bard. A bard is an oral tradition artist. You can call, or sometimes it can be a minstrel. Do you know what is a minstrel? Minstrel est dans l'art oral, dans la tradition orale. Minstrel, c'est le troubadour. They acted as historian, musician, teacher, and entertainer. For instance, in the epic of Sunjata, l'épopée Sunjata, the griot performance is not only a tale of heroism but a communal event involving drama, audience response, and symbolic gestures. If you take the example of the epic of Sunjata, l'épopée de Sunjata, the griot's performance combines a tale of heroism. It is a communal event, and it involves drumming. It means beating drums. Audience response. You see that the audience is, responding. Audience response, what does it mean? Okay. In Wolof, that's what you call aye. You see a cultural watch in veille culturelle. The performer is singing. And then they say, sumone li rek dengan aye, li ngeen di wax. Or you hear the performer say, sumone tak, tak, dengan nan, tung, tung, tak, tak. And then this is the audience response. That's what we call the audience response. So the performer is acting with the audience. Sometimes you see singers who do it. Okay? And symbolic gestures. Symbolic gestures, you see what is a symbolic gesture? Ku bëgg sa yaay defal nii, ku bëgg sa maam defal nii, ku sa maam defal nii. You hear somebody doing that. I just use these examples to help you understand. Okay? These are symbolic gestures. So African oral literature is therefore multimedia in nature. It involves voice, gesture, rhythm, space. It's not merely a story, but an event that brings the community together. It is both a work of art and a social occasion. Yes, this is very. You see that the performance is very important. Now, performance and communal function. The performance in African society was deeply communal. Yes. Communal when it engages a community. Literature was not created for individual consumption, but for collective participation. Yes, understand this, class. Literature was not produced for just individual consumption. Yes, but it had a kind of collective participation. It means it's for the whole community. The audience played an active role responding to the performer's chants, joining in refrain and sometimes improving or elaborating a story. Okay? What does it mean? Sometimes I explain it to you right now. You see the performer saying this, and the performer would say to the audience, so it means this is what you have to do. Sometimes they can clap, sometimes they can sing, sometimes they can do other things. So in Wolof, in simple words, that's what you hear the performance. So the singer is inviting the audience to participate actively. That's what we say, responding to the performance chant. That's why you see, when a singer comes or a performer comes in a ceremony, there are many people in the audience who understand the song or who understand the poem, and they do it. You can do it here in Senegal. There are popular songs. Yes, because we have a popular culture. When we talk about this, so it's not individual, it is collective. I may go to the Jola Society or the Pular or the Mandé. Even if they sing it, I can repeat. It's because it's not individual, it is collective. People know this. This is popular culture. So because of this participatory nature, oral literature constantly evolved. So it has evolved in time. So this means that no two performances of the same story were identical. No, do not take this for granted to say that all performances are the same. No, each retelling introduced subtle variations depending on the performer's creativity and the context. Yeah, I told you the context is very important. You cannot say that it's the same thing, the same time, the same way. No, it depends on the audience and on the performer. So African oral performances were integrated into daily life and labor. So our daily life and labor is work. That's why you see in other contexts where people work or whatever, they use the oral performance. What is your question? Yes. Someone say, yes, sir, if African literature was oral before the arrival explorers and colonizers, we can say that it is thanks to their arrival that it has developed, thanks to the languages they have introduced in Africa. Yes, I can say that. Yeah. Please don't write on the board. Somebody is writing on the board. I don't know who that is, but it's a good comment here. Our oral tradition existed before the arrival of missionaries, of the colonizers. But today, with the languages they have given us, the system of writing, it has made it easier for African people to develop their cultures. It is now known thanks to Western education. I agree with you. But you will see some people who are very categorical, who are very conservative, who don't like that appreciation. But I'm part of those who are very positive. All right? So for all gathering crops during the harvest seasons or clear the fields, women grind, fishermen row loose, hunters preparing traps. Let's on this class. African oral performances were integrated into and labor. That's why you see when a woman is washing, other can be there singing. Oh, sorry, there is a network. I think I was out. All right, I'm back. So there is a, yeah, I was here. So African oral performances were integrated into daily life and labor. What does it mean? So it means that songs accompanied all forms of work. Any kind of work, you can find people using them. For example, a woman doing the laundry, washing in the kitchen, a jola or a serer can be singing a traditional song. Or you see a wall of a descendant of Njai Njai or Ajor Ngonelatir Fal singing, they do it. You see fishermen who are in Getnar or whatever, they can use traditional songs or poems to celebrate their culture or ancestors. You see a wrestler, maybe a descendant of Dubales or Mamgor Ginjai. They are wrestlers. Their children can use traditional songs because they are born in this culture. Okay? So you see people in the rural area grinding millet or cassava, they can use that. So these work songs motivate laborers. Yes, they motivate. For example, are you familiar, guys, with the harvest season? La saison des récoltes ou des moissons. Those, I don't know if there are Pular who are here. If they do what they call Jaber or they go to the harvest, they use these songs. Okay? They sing, they dance. You see people looking. This motivates. It builds rhythm or coordination and raises a sense of solidarity. Similarly, songs and chants marked important rites of passage. Yes, we can talk about rites such as birth, initiation, marriage, or death. Sometimes it can be in a funeral, sometimes it can be in a passage. And this is very present in the Serer society or as ethnic groups in the Casamance, the Jola, the Manjak, the Sose, etc. Take the Bukut practice. So African literature in this sense was not detached art, but an essential component of social and spiritual life. Is it okay, class? Now, section 3, education, morality, and the role of literature. Oral literature also played a crucial role in education. Before the establishment of Western style schools, the African fireplace or the village square served as classroom where elders instructed the young in the values and customs of their people. Storytelling sessions, often held in the evenings, combined entertainment without instruction. Through folktales featuring animals, the tortoise, hare, or hyena, lion, children learned lessons about honesty, humility, hard work, and social cooperation. What does this mean, class? The oral literature played a crucial role in education. Before we had the occasion to read a book, a narration, to read a novel or poetry, we had traditional school, what we call the African fireplace. In the past, in the houses, what people used to use is a fireplace. Okay? In the middle of the house, or for example, if you see the dara, what people use, a traditional dara. People are not using electricity, they use a fireplace. Yes, this was like a classroom. And storytelling session started. You see an old man or an old woman telling stories, folk tales. And in these, they feature animals like tortoise. Tortoise, c'est la tortue. Faites attention, on prononce tortoise. Hare, c'est lièvre. Hyena, lion. Okay? And everything and everything. In our culture, they say buki, lek. In Pular, they say bojel edem. A fowl. Okay? So moreover, oral literature functioned as a repository of history and culture. In societies without written records, praise singers and storytellers preserved genealogies, recorded the deeds, and transmitted ancestral wisdom, communities, ethics, and worldview, ensuring cultural continuity. So you see the legacy. The oral tradition was transmitted from generation to generation. There was a traditional school, I repeat again, the fireplace. It could be an ordinary scene where old men or people of different generations or age meet and they teach them through folktales performance. Is it okay, class? Is it so far clear for you? Is it clear for you? Can I progress? So don't forget to ask your questions and post them in the chat. Okay, now section 4, the emergence of modern African literature. Now, we have moved from the oral tradition and we now deal with the emergence of modern African literature. In my introduction, I told you what is modern African literature. It is a transition. Now we live in oral culture, now going to written culture. The coming of writing and colonial influence. So the advent of European colonialism in the 19th century society including Sorry, class. Today there is a network issue. Okay, you have to understand that there is a. I think the network is not going well. There is a network issue. Okay. Okay. So I was here. As I told you, you need to understand there is a network issue. Okay, now I told you that after the oral, now we are at the time or in the event of European colonization. So this is the emergence of modern African literature, the coming of writing and colonial influence. So now Europeans have come to Africa, they have colonized us, they have built the schools, They have brought versions of the Bible into local languages and introducing African to the written world. Now, early African converts, those who joined the new religion or those who joined Western school, they could write, they could read, but it was in Europe, but not yet in African languages. But you need to know that here, to teach them to read and write in European languages. But while Africa had earlier forms of writing, in Africa, there were earlier forms of writing like the Jez in Ethiopia. They use a certain way of writing. Or the Ajami, those who have learned Arabic know Ajami is Arabic script, Arabic characters. So you go to Tuba or wherever, you find people who are using Ajami. It means even now people who are in the domain of business, okay? You find people who use Ajami. They use Arabic system used across the continent, okay? They were not very popular. So the colonial period just marks the beginning of modern African literature. So class understands that colonization marked the beginning of modern African literature. It is a literature written mainly in English, French, Portuguese, Spanish, etc., or Arabic. So early written works often reflected the tension between African identity and colonial domination. The true flowering of African literature came in the mid-20th century with authors like Chinua Achebe, Ngugi wa Thiong'o from Kenya, Wole Soyinka from Nigeria, and Kamara Laye from Guinea. Who use and resistance. For example, Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Le Monde s'effondre in French, is considered a classic of African literature, like the Francophone novel. Chinua is an Anglophone novel. And these are classics of African literature. They tell you about the class of cultures, okay, choc de culture. These novels, African traditional values, how colonization tried to destabilize African traditions, how tradition or how modernity tried to make tradition collapse, and you read Things Fall Apart, or you read Ambiguous Adventure, you find it there. So Achebe, Chinua Achebe from Nigeria, he represents the Igbo world before and during colonial intrusion in the Igbo land. While when you read Ambiguous Adventure by Sheikh Hamidou Khan exposes the process of colonial domination over the Jalobe through the difficult class. If you read Things Fall Apart, you see Okonkwo. Okonkwo was a great wrestler, a traditional Igbo giant and warrior who resisted to colonization to preserve and keep the Igbo culture, to prevent it from dying. And in Ambiguous Adventure, you find the hero Samba Jallo, who is a nephew to the most royal lady, the tradition. So similarly, in the same way, Ngugi wa Thiong'o from Kenya, a famous African writer who passed away last year, published Weep Not Child. Weep Not Child is an interesting novel that explored the effects, the consequences of colonialism, and the struggle for independence of Kenya. You know, Kenya, there is a cultural group that is called Mawa. The Mawa, they wanted to keep their land, but the colonizers wanted to take the land of the Mawa. So they use literature not only as a work of art, but also as a means of expression and a means of cultural valorization and revalorization and a means of resistance and protest and a means of criticism. Is it okay, class? Can I progress? Are there questions? Can I progress? Okay, now section B, the interaction between oral and written traditions. So you see that now we are in the era of modernity. So the oral tradition did not die. Don't think that it died totally. That's what many people think. No. There is a combination, there is an interaction between them. Modern African literature owes much to the oral tradition. What does it mean in French? La littérature africaine moderne doit beaucoup à la tradition orale. It's very clear. Modern African literature owes much to oral tradition. La littérature africaine moderne doit beaucoup à la tradition orale. C'est sa source. Because the oral tradition is a source of African literature. It is a source of inspiration. It has not died totally. The transition from orality to literacy did not erase indigenous forms. No, it did not eradicate indigenous form. Instead, many writers incorporated oral elements into written texts to preserve authenticity and cultural identity. No, class, do not think that when modern literature came, the oral traditions died. No, there is a certain way of recreation, reimagination, reaffirmation. The oral forms are included and integrated in the written form. This blend, it means mixture, mélange, brassage of old and new, create what scholars call the oral written continuum. Writers employed various oral techniques. Oral written continuum, they are in a certain continuity. Okay? They employed oral techniques. Look at proverbs and idioms to express cultural wisdom. You find it in Chinua Achebe or Ngugi wa Thiong'o. They do it extensively. Call and response structures in plays and poetry. Call and response, as I told you, this is what you call the IM. The performer sings and the audience replies. In plays, c'est le théâtre, pièce de théâtre, poetry, reflecting communal interaction. Song-like rhythms in prose and verse, echoing traditional performance. Narrative digressions or repetitions, characteristic of oral storytelling. So, class, the oral tradition did not die. There is a survival. It is combined in that. Modern African writing. Major influences on modern African writing. Here, you need to tradition on African modern writing cannot be overstated. What does it mean? Oral art provides structure, and combine African literary. Here, it means that has been influenced by oral form. This oral form type. So the fact the storyteller combines oral forms with written forms is African authenticity. So writers draw on folk narrative. Writers, it means writers take in populaire, ou bien les récits populaires, praise poetry or communal philosophy or whatever. The song of Kodusen, Yande Kodusen, or who uses the song of Aja Harmbai or whatever. It's because these are popular, folk culture. It speaks with African voices even when expressed in European languages. Yes, class. This is a sense of authenticity and cultural celebration. So even if the writer writes in French or English or Spanish, understands that the text is using an African voice. So it is Africa is speaking in a European language. So it is African culture moving in a European language. Do you get me, class? You take a typical Serer or Jola or Pular or Mandinka tradition or song. You recreate it in French or English. You are using African culture in a European language. So the text is in English or in Spanish, but it has an African voice. It could be a Serer Dos, or it could be a Jola or a Mandinka. So it means African literature is inseparable from history. This is our history. Our oral culture and our written culture, they go hand in hand. So the continent's experience of slavery, colonization, resistance, independence, and post-colonial challenges shapes its thematic and emotional core. So do you see that? The fact is that Africa was shocked. Africa experienced slavery, colonization, resistance, independence, and post-colonial challenges. All these are used as pretexts to express them in the thematic and emotional core. In the text, you find there these events. So writers have used literature as a tool of self-definition and social and political critique. Remember in the first semester, I told you about function of here, African writers of the to define themselves, to affirm themselves culturally, to say culturally, this is my definition. I'm a Jola, I'm a Serer, I'm a Pular, I'm a Mandinka. I'm Africa, rooted in Africa. Read David Job, Africa, my Africa, Africa of great warriors and ancestors. If you read the text, it is in French or in English or in whatever, you find your. So it is important to know that many influences can be noticed in modern African literature. But among them, one can mention the main contributions of the pioneer generation, the second generation, the contemporary generation, the African environment, and the language of expression. Class, what should you understand here is, as I told you, this text in a European language expressing an African problem or an African case, an African voice. What is important is that, okay, when we talk about the contributions to modern African literature, you have to give credit to thank or appreciate the pioneer generation. It means the first generation, the second generation, the contemporary generation, the African environment. It means the setting, the paysage, l'environnement culturel, and the language of expression. All these factors are very important in knowing where is modern African literature going. Before I progress, I should ask you a question, class. Is it okay so far? Or do you have questions? Post them in the chat. Yes, Musa Huma said they have civilized us. They have joined the school. Yeah, they have influenced us. But Huma, be very careful with this. When you say Europeans have civilized us, it means we were not civilized. Be very careful. Maybe say they have taught us their civilization. We had our own civilization. Okay? Huma. African people do not like this. Say they have taught us their civilization, or we have learned their civilization. If you say they have civilized us, it looks like we are civilized. Okay? Avoid using, I know first year students always make these mistakes. Yes, it is a misconception. Ethnologues or historians do not like that. They want you to say we have learned their civilization, or they have taught us. You see, some historians even say they have imposed us their civilization. But if you say they have civilized us, it means that we do not have any civilization. We were not civilized. No, we were civilized. All right? But you understand. Now, let us deal with, in French, it means la génération pionnière, la génération des pionniers. Okay, the pioneer generation. The pioneer generation concerns early entire colonial writers. Yes, the pioneer generation is a generation of the first writers. They were entire colonialists. Okay? They were anti-colonialists. They did not like colonization. Okay? So, Huma, you understand. The anti-colonialists, they criticize what colonization did. The pioneer generation of African writers, primarily active from 1950s to the 1970s, includes prominent figures like Tunde Achebe from Nigeria, Wole Soyinka, Thomas Mofola, Amos Titwala, Cyprian Ekwensi, Flora Wapa, who wrote to challenge colonial narrative and explore African traditions and the impact of colonization. So this generation of writers, they wrote to show to people that colonization devastated Africa. It wanted to eradicate our traditions, but we resisted. They used Western languages to express African difficulties and hardships. Other important writers, Okigbo, you have Kofi Awuru from Ghana, Amata Aidu from Ghana, John Pepper Clark, and Gabriel Okara, etc. If I ask you a list of pioneer writers or the pioneer generation, you can give. Okay, the second generation. The second generation includes post-independence writers. It means writers after independence. Okay? The second generation of African writers primarily active in the 1970s. 1970s, it is a period after many African countries independences to the 1980s to get their independence. This generation focused on critical themes. This generation focused on critical class. I'm really sorry today. The network is not very good. But I my best to navigate the difficulties. Okay, are you with me? The connection is not good. I'm sorry for that, class. You can hear me? Aminata Timorswa. Class, can you hear me? Sorry, the connection is not very strong today. Can you post in the chat if you can hear me? Okay. Okay. The second generation, as I told you, the second generation emerged colonization devastated our traditions and everything. And the second generation, they focus on critical themes like political corruption and the disintegration of social values. This generation includes prominent figures like Niyi Oshundare, Isidore Okwewo, Festus Iyai, Buchi Emecheta, etc. Their work often builds upon the themes of decolonization from the first new political and social realities of independent nations. Because after this, you see that African people wanted to get their independence, to build new nations, but they realized that the leaders were corrupt. There were corruption, there were violence, there were kind of cultural alienation, and they criticized these people. Their writing covered critical social and political commentary. It was very political and critical. C'est la désillusion with post-colonial leadership, tackling issues like political corruption, military rule, and social injustice. So because after independence, people thought that life will be better, the countries will become strong. But these writers realized that our leaders were corrupt, they were corruption. They also focus on national realities. So colonialism, the second generation often wrote about the challenges and realities of building of a new nation. What does this mean? If the first generation criticized, were fighting colonization, how European generation criticized African leaders, saying that the building of the new nation was not a big success. They were kind of disillusion, deception, okay? They were the kind of, corruption. And then now, and you may see that there are writers whom I quote in the first generation and who are still here. Take the case of Wole Soyinka. He is still alive. So he has gone through all the generations. You take the case of Ngugi wa Thiong'o from Kenya. Ngugi only passed away last year. But is a way of calling this contemporary the contemporary generation, young one that has inspiration from the first generation. So contemporary African writers include a diverse group of authors like Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who is from Nigeria, Teju Cole, Ellen Oyeyemi, who are often influenced by themes like migration. Now they talk about migration, identity, post-colonialism, immigration. Yes, it's because that's what their generation has found: immigration, identity, globalization. So this generation is also marked by new publishing trends. Okay, there is a certain characteristic. They publish in different things, and they focus on new perspective in literary landscape. So they think of spatial or other original things. And among them, you can find Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie from Nigeria and Sisi Dangaremba from Zimbabwe, as I told you, who most of the time explore themes like globalization, gender, and identity. Okay, now I move to the influences of African environment. I told you about the influences of the generation. Now, to what extent or when can we talk about influences of the African environment? C'est l'environnement, c'est le paysage, c'est le cadre culturel. Yes, c'est l'environnement. So, writers use them as a metaphor for social values and human behavior. For example, the Iroko tree, c'est un arbre, il n'est pas présent peut-être dans notre zone, peut-être au Nigeria, they call it Iroko. C'est un arbre très, très, très grand. Au Kenya, il y en a. The Iroko tree, for instance, symbolizes strength and continuity. Take, for example, the baobab symbolizes resistance. Yes. Tortoise, it is an animal, c'est la tortue. It is cunning and wisdom. The eagle, look at Nigeria, they call themselves the eagles. Vision and power, they call themselves the elephant. Senegal, the lion. In Senegal, we use a baobab. In Nigeria or other countries, they use the Iroko tree. So this imagery is a reflection. You are interconnected. Okay? So it means man and the environment are connected. This deep respect for the environment also appears in modern ecological, eco-critical African writing. So you see, in modern African literature, you find this is very present. Authors or deforestation or urbanization on traditional lifestyle. If you read novels like The River Between or The Grain of Wheat by Ngugi Nzaluma or Usman Woods or The Beggar's Strike by Aminata, some big influences of the environment realism. You read The Beggar's Strike, La Grève des Bateaux, d'Aminata Sofa, or God's Beats of Wood, Le Bout de Bois de Dieu, de Sem Ben Ousmane, or A Walk in the you find all these realities. Other people, you find them there. Les Contes d'Amadou Koumba, read them. Now, the language of expression. Class, it is important to know the role that the language of expression has played in African literature. You need to know that it was not easy. It was a big debate. Some people thought, what is African literature? Should African literature be written in European languages? Class, I ask you the question. Can you answer me? Class, I ask you the question before I progress. If you are asked this question, should African literature be written in African languages, or should African literature be written in European languages? Or what should be the language of African literature? Can you answer me, class? Give me your opinion, please. Post your opinion in the chat, please. I give you 1 minute to post your opinion in the chat. The language of expression. Should African literature be written in African languages, or should African literature be written in European languages? Or in simple words, what should be the language of African literature? In African languages or in European languages? Can you give me your answer in the chat, please, class? And then I will develop. Give me your answer, class. Please give me your answer. Are you with me? Are you following? Can you give me your answer? Class, please take 1 minute to post in the chat, and I want to see your answer, and then I comment on. Yes, I say, yes, there was an internet network issue, yeah. Please, yes, I say African literature would be written in African language, as I say, African literature in European languages or African languages. Here, what you need to know is the language has been one of the most debated issues in African literary discourse. It means that scholars, intellectuals discuss. They met several times in conferences or in organizations, in events, discussing what should be the perspective of African literature. Should African literature be written in African languages, or should African literature be written in European languages? There were many important conferences, but I only gave you the most important. Many scholarly conferences and events have been organized over the issue. Among them, the Makerere Conference in Uganda. In Uganda, in 1962, there was a conference. In Dakar, the Dakar Conference in March 1962, and also Furebe Conference in April 33, in 1933, and the Asmara Declaration on African Literature and Languages in 2000. Okay, so all these debates about what should African writers do to use or to write African literature in African languages or in European languages. Intellectuals like Obi Wali argued that African literature must be written in African languages. That's what Obi Wali said. Obi Wali defends that African literature written in European languages is a dead end, c'est inutile. Since, why? Because language but carries culture, and true African expression must occur in indigenous tongue. For Obiwali, to keep the originality or to express everything the way they want, the authenticity, African literature can only communicate in African languages. In contrast, Chinua Achebe argued for the creative appropriation of English. Chinua Achebe said, no, we have learned English, European languages. I have been given this language and I intend to use it. We can do a kind of appropriation, recreation, reimagination. We use our English or our French, but we put a certain dose, a combination of African cultural elements to refine it, give it an African style. This could be called Africanization of English. He believed African writers could reshape English to reflect African thought and rhythm. Ngugi wa Thiong'o from Kenya, however, later rejected. Ngugi was also supporting Obiwali, saying that African literature should be written in African languages. And Ngugi wrote, finally, Ngugi rejected writing in English. Ngugi wrote in Kikuyu, advocating linguistic decolonization, because Ngugi talks about decolonizing the mind. He says that when you use the language of the colonizer, we still colonize ourselves. We should do a kind of decolonizing the mind to get free from mental slavery and colonial domination. That's what Ngugi wa Thiong'o said. Is it clear for you, class? Now you understand the debate question. But understand that even though it was very problematic, there were many contradictions, okay? The debate highlights the dual heritage. The debate shows the double heritage of African literature, having a double culture in European language background and also in African. And now understand that the debate has progressed a lot. You see many people who radicalize, who are in this camp or in that camp. What is important is to understand that the debate has brought African literature to a very interesting perspective. Today, African literature is written in both European and African languages. And understand that I do not want to develop a lot this section. It's too early as beginners. It was just to let you know what happened with the language. Next year, in the second year, you will have, very exhaustive development about the language issue in African literature. And I will share my papers, my research on African literature to help you understand many things about this. All right? Questions? Are you with me? Yes, it is Laigay who said in European languages. Others said in African languages. Yes, those who say in European languages, most of the time they would say that it's because we need, to be read and understood by a big audience. And if you write in African languages, the problem is not everyone can read African languages or write African languages. So themes and voices in contemporary African literature. Gender and the rise of women writers. Yes, gender, c'est le genre. And you know that today gender is very important. Many people talk about parity, gender, everything. So for much of the early modern period, African literature was dominated by male voices. If you take the beginning of African literature, you can say that it was dominated by male voices, male patriarchal educational structures. It's because of patriarchal society, okay? C'est des sociétés patriarcales. It means that our societies, our cultures are dominated by men. Okay, Omar C, it's okay. All right. So, however, in the 20th century, saw a powerful emergence of female writers. There was female writers who began articulating women's perspective and challenging gender equality. So you see pioneering women as Flora Wapa, Efuru Buchi Emeseta, The Joys of Motherhood, or Mariama Baso Longoleta. They brought to literature the experiences of motherhood, marriage, female education, and personal freedom. And in South Africa or in East Africa, you see writers like Nadine Gordimer, Sisi Dangaremba, and in Nigeria, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, or in Ghana, Ama Ata Aidoo. All these are women. They expanded these themes to include sexuality, identity, and political participation. And you see some of them who are very engaged. For example, Nadine Gordimer. She was politically engaged and she wrote against the apartheid system. You know what the apartheid system did in South Africa? It was a discrimination of Black people. So Nadine Gordimer attacked the system. She criticized. And that's why you see, as her contribution was valued, she received the Nobel Prize in Literature. So all these women writers do not simply oppose patriarchy. They broaden African literature by showing the diversity of African experiences. So the works or the works of these women writers contribute to what we call gendered nationalism. This means the reimagination of the nation through women's voices and agency. Okay, this is my last section now, B. Globalization, migration, and new identities. Today, if we talk about contemporary African literature is also shaped by globalization, la mondialisation, and the African diaspora. It means African people all around the world. So many influential and leading writers from Africa live abroad. They do not live in Africa, in United States, in Europe, or wherever. Many Senegalese are writing in Europe or in North America. And these people write about the tensions of belonging, displacements, okay? And cultural hybridity, le métissage culturel. Yeah, when they are there, they write about their experience, the tensions of belonging. Do they belong to Europe? Do they belong to Africa? Displacements, the fact of being relocated or displaced. Cultural hybridity, métissage culturel. So writers like Teju Cole, Taye Selassie, Leila Abuela, and Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, they represent Africans navigating global spaces. They represent African characters who are navigating the world, global spaces, and characters that negotiate multiple identities. Their characters, their personages, they negotiate multiple identities. They are part European, part African, part American, part Asian. And they redefine home. Yes, where is home? If you are an African in origin, not born in Africa or born in Africa, but you live in Europe for years, you don't go to Africa, where is home? They redefine. There is one part of them is there. So this new phase of African literature reflects mobility, transnationalism, and interconnectedness. So while some critics argue that diaspora writers are detached from African realities, their works expand African literature into a global conversation, illustrating that African identity is no longer confined by geography. Be very careful, class. There are some critics who think that the diaspora writers, they are detached. It means they are disconnected from African realities. Their works expand African literature into a global conversation. It means that their work make, African literature converse with other world literatures. And this illustrates that African identity is no longer confined by geography. being an African is not related to the geography. It is now global. These are the references. I am at the end of my presentation, so I hope everything was okay for you today. Like yesterday, despite the technical challenges, I want to hear from you to get your questions if you have some. This is the end of the first chapter of African literature. I hope it was helpful for you. I hope the session was helpful for you. So class, this is the end of the session. If you have questions, you can post them in the chat. I can take 1 or 2 or 3 before we end. So I would like to thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for today. Have a good day. Thank you, class. I hope it was